The ballroom of the plaza glittered like a diamond that night. Chandeliers dripping light, violins whispering wealth, and the sound of crystal glasses clinking against betrayal. Grace Whitmore stood by the marble column, her silk gown clinging to her 6-month pregnant body, trying to breathe through the suffocating scent of Chanel and champagne. Her husband, Nathaniel Voss, the man New York called the Empire Maker, was across the room, his arm draped casually around his PR assistant, Callie Grant. The cameras didn't even bother to hide anymore. Grace's hand trembled around her glass of water. She had told herself the rumors were lies. But when Callie leaned in and pressed her lips against Nathaniel's cheek, slow, deliberate, under the chandelier's full light, the flash from the photographers hit Grace like lightning. Her heart didn't shatter, it went numb. She forced a smile for the crowd, whispered, "Excuse me," and slipped out into the icy night. Outside, snowflakes landed on the black Mercedes waiting at the curb. The city lights blurred as she sat inside, her phone buzzing with gossip notifications. Nate Voss spotted with new flame. The words crawled across her screen like knives. She deleted the news alert and looked out toward Fifth Avenue, her reflection pale against the glass. She touched her stomach. "We're leaving soon," she whispered to the baby. When Nate finally returned to their penthouse at Voss Tower near midnight, he smelled of whiskey and perfume. He didn't even take off his tuxedo jacket. "Why weren't you at my side?" he asked, voice cold. The donors noticed. Grace's laugh broke, quiet, hollow. "I think they noticed your assistant more." For a moment, silence stretched across the marble floor. Then, in a tone sharper than glass, he said, "Don't start this now. You know how much I've done for you." She looked at him. Really looked, and realized she no longer saw her husband, only a stranger wearing the face of the man she once trusted. She picked up the Mont Blanc pen he used to sign million-dollar deals and placed it next to their framed wedding photo. "You built empires, Nate, but you destroyed our home." He laughed, dismissive. "You wouldn't last a week without me." Grace slipped off her wedding ring and set it beside the pen. "Then let's see," she said softly. She walked toward the elevator, coat over her shoulders, heels clicking like the countdown of a bomb. As the doors closed, she whispered, "Goodbye." Back inside, Nate poured himself another drink, confident she'd crawl back by morning. But when dawn came, her clothes were gone, the safe was empty, and the security camera had captured her last glance at the skyline. He had no idea that in losing her that night, he'd just created his greatest rival. Morning sunlight cut through the penthouse windows like a blade. Nathaniel Voss sat at the dining table, scrolling through his iPad, while headlines about his wife's mysterious disappearance flooded the tabloids. "The billionaire's wife walks out. Sources claim infidelity." But the article took a darker turn. Someone had leaked confidential documents suggesting Grace Whitmore had embezzled $5 million from the Voss Foundation charity. Grace saw the same headline on an old iPhone screen hours later, sitting in a small cafe on the edge of Brooklyn. Her hands trembled as she read. It was Nathaniel's handwriting on the digital files. She recognized his phrasing, his fake formality. He had planted it. He wasn't content with betrayal. He wanted her erased. She tried calling him once. It went straight to voicemail. Then came a text. "Do not contact me again. You'll hear from my lawyers." Grace pressed her hand against her stomach, fighting nausea and disbelief. The baby kicked, small, defiant, as if reminding her to keep breathing. She left a $20 bill on the table and walked into the winter wind. By noon, her face was everywhere. News anchors repeated the story. Voss charity funds missing. Wife vanishes. They showed old gala photos of her smiling beside him, calling her the quiet architect behind the scandal. The same people who once envied her now mocked her. At Voss Tower, Nathaniel's PR team gathered in the boardroom, drafting statements. Callie Grant sat at the head of the table, her diamond bracelet flashing under the lights. "We'll spin it," she said smoothly. Grace was unstable, pregnant, emotional, under pressure. "It'll make Nate look sympathetic." Nate didn't respond. He just sipped his espresso, wearing the calm of a man who thought he'd already won. But deep down, a faint unease stirred. The security footage showed her leaving empty-handed. No jewelry, no cash, nothing. Yet the foundation transfer was done perfectly, with all the right codes, almost too perfect. That night, Grace returned to their old home in secret. The doorman didn't recognize her. She'd traded her fur coat for a thrift store jacket and hidden her face under a hood. She sneaked into the mailroom, opened a storage locker, and pulled out a folder she'd hidden months ago. Copies of contracts, passwords, bank ledgers, evidence she had kept just in case. The folder was empty. Someone had already taken it. Heart pounding, Grace looked up at the camera lens above her. The red light blinked. Someone was watching. She fled through the underground garage, her breath sharp and ragged. Behind her, the sound of heels echoed, Callie's voice mocking and low. "You really thought he'd ever choose you, Grace?" Grace turned, eyes burning. "You'll find out what he does to women he's done using." Callie smirked. "Oh, I already know." Security guards arrived, but Callie waved them off. "She's trespassing," she said sweetly. They dragged Grace out, throwing her into the cold street. Her stomach cramped with pain. She collapsed, whispering, "Not now, please, not now." Hours later, she woke up in a hospital bed. The doctor's face was pale, his voice softer than mercy. "I'm sorry," he said. "You lost the baby." The world went silent. The machines beeped steadily, but Grace didn't move. She stared at the ceiling until tears blurred it into light. By dawn, she was gone again. No hospital bracelet, no trace left behind. Back in his penthouse, Nate scrolled through the latest article. Grace Whitmore still missing, likely fled the country. He leaned back, satisfied. She'll never survive this. But far from Manhattan, on a snow-covered highway toward Boston, a passing car stopped for a woman walking barefoot in the storm. The man who opened the door would one day become the reason Nate Voss lost everything. Snow kept falling like ash when Grace opened her eyes again. She was in the back seat of a black SUV, wrapped in a wool blanket, the city lights fading behind her. The driver glanced at her through the mirror. A man in his early 40s, sharp jawline, kind eyes. "You were about to freeze out there," he said. "I'm Marcus Hale." She didn't answer. Her voice was gone, swallowed by exhaustion and grief. He drove in silence for miles until they reached a rest stop outside Boston. He handed her a cup of hot coffee from Starbucks, steam curling like hope between them. "You don't have to talk," he said. "Just warm up." Grace stared at the paper cup, her reflection trembling in its lid. Her baby was gone. Her marriage was gone. Her name was poison. Everything she built erased overnight. The weight of it hit her like a wave. She bent forward, the sobs coming so violently she could hardly breathe. Marcus stayed beside her, saying nothing, just letting her cry. By morning, she was in a small guest house owned by one of Marcus's associates. He'd called ahead, told them she was a consultant from New York who needed a quiet place to rest. She stayed for days, barely moving, surviving on tea and silence. On the 5th day, she finally spoke. "Why did you help me?" Marcus looked up from his laptop. "Because I've seen what Voss does to people he can't control." Grace froze. "You know him?" Marcus gave a bitter laugh. "He stole a development project from my firm 3 years ago. Used my designs, my investors, my ideas, all under a shell company. Everyone believed him because he had the power to erase me from the industry." For the first time, Grace met his eyes. "He destroyed you too." "Not destroyed," Marcus said quietly, "just delayed." Something in her shifted, a small spark under all the numbness. Over the next few weeks, she helped him review blueprints and proposals, mostly to distract herself. But her instincts came back. She saw flaws others missed, suggested layouts that improved cost efficiency. One night, Marcus walked in and found her reworking an entire design board. "You're good at this," he said. "I used to be an architect," she whispered. He studied her, realizing she wasn't just another broken woman. She was brilliant, and someone had made her forget that. Then one morning, the quiet life shattered again. The Boston news station played a live broadcast, Nathaniel Voss announcing his engagement to Callie Grant. He was smiling, polished, untouchable. But what stopped Grace's breath was the background, a luxury interior she had designed years ago. Her style, her signature, her stolen work. Marcus turned off the TV slowly. "He's using your designs for his new Manhattan tower." Grace clenched her fists. "He took everything, even my art." "Then take it back," Marcus said, not by crying, by outsmarting him. She looked at him like he was speaking a different language. Revenge wasn't survival. It was dangerous. But when she opened her old email account later that night, she found a new message from an unknown sender. Subject: "You're not crazy. He forged your signature." Attached was a PDF, a scan of a contract showing a $5 million transfer, signed with her name in handwriting that wasn't hers. Grace's pulse quickened. Whoever sent it knew the truth. Outside, snow melted on the window, forming tiny rivers against the glass. She stared at them until the first light of dawn crept through. For the first time in months, she felt something close to power. She didn't know it yet, but the woman who once begged for love was about to become the storm that would drown him. The first thing Grace noticed about Marcus Hale wasn't his wealth, though it whispered through every detail of his life. It was the quiet steadiness in his voice, the kind of calm born from surviving his own storms. He never asked questions about her past, never pried into her silences. He just gave her space and work. By February, she was sketching again. The scent of fresh paper and graphite filled the small Boston studio Marcus had lent her. When she worked, her hands stopped trembling. Every line she drew felt like reclaiming something she'd lost. Marcus dropped by often, always dressed in tailored coats, carrying his iPad and a Mont Blanc pen. He'd ask for her input on layouts, budgets, or designs for Hale Urban Group's new eco-district in Chicago. Grace stayed behind the scenes, signing emails only as AL, her alias Anna Lewis. One night, Marcus found her asleep at the drafting table, the blueprints glowing under the desk lamp. He covered her with his coat, paused, then noticed the faint scar on her wrist, the mark of a hospital band. He realized she wasn't just rebuilding a career, she was fighting to stay alive. Weeks turned into months. Grace started laughing again, quietly at first. She joined meetings remotely, her voice disguised under her alias. Marcus trusted her so completely that soon she was handling investor presentations. Her precision, her calm, her vision, they all returned, layer by layer. Then came the night that changed everything. Marcus was hosting a dinner with potential investors at a riverside restaurant overlooking the Charles River. The skyline shimmered behind the glass, candlelight reflecting off crystal glasses. Grace arrived late, wearing a simple navy dress. When she walked in, one of the guests froze, a journalist named Julia Byrne. Julia's fork clattered. "Grace Whitmore," she whispered. The name sliced through the air like broken glass. Grace froze, pulse hammering. Marcus looked between them. "You two know each other?" Julia's face shifted from shock to urgency. "You shouldn't be here. They said you were dead." Grace's breath caught. "Who said that?" Julia lowered her voice. "Nathaniel Voss. He made it look like you took your own life after stealing from his charity. The story was buried after he paid off the tabloids." The restaurant noise faded. Grace could hear only her heartbeat. Julia slid a small flash drive across the table. "I was one of the journalists who refused to run it. I kept digging. What I found could destroy him, if you're ready to come back." Marcus watched the two women in silence. When Grace didn't reach for the flash drive, he said softly, "You don't have to rush, but you can't hide forever either." Grace stared at the tiny piece of plastic like it was a ticking bomb. If she opened it, she'd be at war again, against a man with limitless money, power, and reach. But if she didn't, he'd keep living his golden lie. That night, back at the studio, she sat before her laptop, the flash drive resting beside a cup of untouched coffee. Snow tapped against the window like impatient fingers. When she finally inserted it, folders appeared. Documents, transfers, recordings. In one video, she saw Nate in his office talking to Callie. "I made it look like her signature," he said. "She'll never prove anything. No one believes a ghost." Grace's hand flew to her mouth. Her chest tightened with a strange mix of grief and fury. The next morning, Marcus found her standing at the window, the drive in her hand. Her eyes were steady now, her voice low. "He buried me once. I think it's time I learned how to dig." And for the first time, Marcus saw not a victim, but a woman ready to burn an empire down. The morning Boston woke to sunlight after weeks of gray. Grace Whitmore, still living as Anna Lewis, opened the flash drive again. She watched the same video on repeat, pausing every time Nathaniel's face appeared, his tone so casual it made her stomach twist. "She'll never prove anything," he'd said. "People forget women like her." For months she'd tried to forget him. But now his words were played like a dare. Grace printed every file, pinned every photo to a corkboard she found in Marcus's office. Financial reports, wire transfers, shell companies, all linked to Voss Dynamics. Every arrow she drew pointed back to one name, Nathaniel Voss. Marcus walked in and froze. "You've been busy," he said. Grace didn't look up. "I need to see what he took from me." "You mean what he took from us?" Marcus replied. "That Chicago project? The zoning designs he stole? You designed those interiors. I drew the plans. We just didn't know it back then." She met his gaze, startled. "He used both of our work?" Marcus nodded. "He's been feeding off other people's genius for years." For a moment the room was silent except for the hum of the city outside. Then Grace whispered, "I'm done running." They spent days building a digital timeline of Voss's fraud. Grace worked 12 hours a day, her eyes dry, her heart steady. She didn't sleep much. The nightmares had changed. No longer about being chased, but about chasing. One night, Marcus brought her takeout and 2 cups of coffee. "You can't fight him alone," he said. "I'm not," she replied, scrolling through data. "I have you, and I have the truth." But the truth had teeth. Within a week, Voss Dynamics' cybersecurity system flagged an intrusion. Someone inside the company was trying to trace the leak. Her leak. Julia called in a panic. "Grace, they know someone accessed those files. You need to go dark again." Grace's hands trembled. "I can't hide every time he breathes. I'm tired of being invisible." But hours later, her studio door was kicked open. 2 men in dark suits entered, flashing fake FBI badges. "Anna Lewis?" one demanded. Marcus arrived seconds later, his voice cold. "She's with me. You're trespassing." The men left, but the message was clear. Nate still had reach. That night, Grace packed her things. "If I stay, you'll get dragged into this," she told Marcus. He caught her wrist. "You're not the only one," he buried Grace. "Don't shut me out." For a long moment she looked at him, really looked. The anger in her chest softened into something she hadn't felt in years, trust. "Then help me end this," she said. He nodded once. "I will. But on one condition, you fight as yourself. No more hiding behind Anna. The world needs to remember your name." Grace hesitated. The thought of saying Grace Whitmore out loud felt like touching an open wound. But she knew he was right. "Then the world will remember," she whispered. The next morning, she walked into a courthouse with Julia at her side and filed an anonymous whistleblower report against Voss Dynamics. It was the first domino. Meanwhile, in Manhattan, Nathaniel stared at a legal notice on his desk, federal inquiry into charitable misconduct. His smile didn't falter, but his jaw tightened. He turned to Callie. "Find out who did this." Callie hesitated. "What if it's her?" Nate laughed, but it sounded forced. "Grace Whitmore's dead." Far away, Grace pressed send on the final file transfer, her reflection gleaming in her MacBook screen. And for the first time in years, she felt alive, because the man who buried her had just heard her heartbeat again. Spring melted Boston's snow into rivers that shimmered beneath the bridges, carrying away what was dead and forgotten. Grace watched from the window of her new apartment, smaller than the penthouse she once lived in, but warmer, real. Every morning she brewed coffee on the stove, opened her MacBook, and rebuilt the life Nathaniel Voss had tried to erase. Her whistleblower report had reached the Federal Investigation Board. It wasn't public yet, but the first crack had appeared in Nate's empire. Journalists were circling, investors were nervous, and small leaks about financial discrepancies had begun appearing online. Grace read every headline without smiling. Revenge wasn't joy, it was survival. Still, the nights were long. She would wake at 3 a.m., drenched in sweat, hearing Nate's voice in her head. "You'll never survive without me." When that happened, she turned on the lamp, took a deep breath, and opened one of the books Marcus had given her, Women Who Run with the Wolves. Its pages whispered courage, reminding her that wounds could become weapons if you refused to let them bleed forever. Marcus visited often, bringing coffee or files from Hale Urban Group. "You're working too hard," he said one night, seeing her surrounded by open folders. "I lost everything because I wasn't careful enough," she said softly. "Now I have to earn every piece back." He studied her for a moment. "You already have, you just don't see it yet." They were quiet for a while. Outside, the rain began to fall, tapping against the glass like a heartbeat. Marcus finally said, "There's something you should know. We're expanding to Manhattan, a new headquarters. I want you to lead the design." Grace froze. "Manhattan?" "It's time," he said simply. The thought of returning to that city, to the place where she'd lost her child, her name, her dignity, made her chest tighten. But she saw the certainty in Marcus's eyes, the faith that she could face it. And maybe she could. Maybe going back wasn't weakness. Maybe it was the only way to take her name out of his shadow. 3 months later, she stood on the 42nd floor of a Park Avenue office tower, sunlight spilling across the polished floor. The space would soon become Hale Urban Group's Manhattan branch, modern, open, everything Nate's empire wasn't. Grace ran her fingers along the window frame, looking out over the skyline she once saw from captivity. Now it looked different, hers, not his. That night, she walked alone through Central Park, past the lake that mirrored the city lights. She stopped by a bench and whispered to the night, "I'm back." But fate wasn't finished testing her. The next morning, Julia called. "Grace, there's something you need to see." She sent a photo, a leaked press release. Voss Dynamics was hosting a massive investment gala to announce a new green partnership with Hale Urban Group. Grace's pulse spiked. She hadn't approved any partnership. Marcus entered moments later, holding the same document. "They're bluffing," he said grimly. "Nate's trying to bait us into a merger. He doesn't know you're here." Grace stared at the paper. "He will soon." Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to face him alone." Grace shook her head. "No. He took everything from me because he thought I'd stay quiet. This time, he's going to hear my voice, loud and clear." That night, she drafted her first official statement as COO of Hale Urban Group. Her name, Grace Whitmore, sat in bold letters at the top. She hit send, her heart steady. And miles away, in his glass-walled office, Nathaniel Voss read that name and dropped his whiskey glass for the first time in his life. Manhattan shimmered that night, golden under the spring rain. Nathaniel Voss sat in his penthouse, a Rolex glinting on his wrist as he stared at his tablet. The headline flashing across Bloomberg's front page froze him mid-sip. Grace Whitmore returns as COO of Hale Urban Group. For a long, silent minute, Nate didn't breathe. His pulse pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. Then came the rage. Hot, animal, uncontrollable. "She was supposed to be gone," he hissed, hurling the tablet against the marble wall. The screen shattered, scattering glass across the floor like the night she left. Meanwhile, in a sleek conference room overlooking Park Avenue, Grace stood before her team at Hale Urban Group. Her tone was calm, professional, but inside, adrenaline burned. "If Voss Dynamics wants a fight," she said, "we'll give them one, in daylight with truth." Marcus watched her from the corner, silent pride in his eyes. She wasn't the broken woman he'd rescued on that snowy highway anymore. She was steel. Still, he worried. "Grace," he said quietly after the meeting, "once we go public, he'll come for you personally." She looked out at the skyline where Voss Tower gleamed like a silver dagger. "He already did," she said. "Now it's my turn." That evening, Julia Byrne met Grace in a quiet cafe near Bryant Park. Julia's hair was pulled into a tight bun, her eyes sharp. She placed an envelope on the table. "I dug deeper," she said. "There's more." Grace hesitated before opening it. Inside were printed emails, exchanges between Nate and several shell companies, offshore accounts, property deals, even political donations tied to Voss Dynamics. But what stopped Grace cold was a folder labeled M. Hale, 2018 Project Acquisition. She scanned the documents. "These are Marcus's stolen blueprints," she whispered. "Nate forged my name on those contracts to legitimize it." Julia nodded. "He used you as cover. You were his scapegoat and his seal of approval." Grace's fingers tightened around the papers. "We can end him with this." Julia lowered her voice. "There's something else. A hidden server, probably kept in Voss Tower. It stores backups of all fraudulent contracts. It's password protected and air-gapped from the internet. You'll need someone inside." Grace stared at her. "Someone like who?" Julia slid a name across the napkin. "Eli Carter." Grace frowned. "He used to work for Voss?" Julia nodded. "He built their cybersecurity wall. Then they fired him when he found out what Nate was hiding. I think he'll help you, for the right reason." That night, Grace met Eli in an underground co-working space lit by neon signs and old coffee machines. He was younger than she expected, with sharp features and tired eyes. "I know what he did to you," Eli said without greeting. "Everyone in that company did, but no one spoke up." "Then speak up now," Grace said firmly. He studied her for a long time, then smirked. "I'll help you. But if we do this, it's not just a leak. It's war." Grace didn't blink. "Then we go to war." Over the next few weeks, Eli worked from the shadows, tunneling into old systems, decrypting fragments. Every night, he sent her pieces of data, invoices, fake signatures, evidence of wire fraud. Each revelation was another nail in Nathaniel's empire. But Grace knew Nate wouldn't stay blind forever. One night, as she reviewed a new file on her MacBook, the screen glitched. A single message appeared across the screen. "You think I don't see you?" NV. Her blood ran cold. He was watching her again. Marcus found her sitting in the dark, eyes wide, hands shaking. "Grace, what happened?" She turned the screen toward him. "He knows." Marcus took a slow breath, then said, "Then it's time to stop hiding. If he wants to play God, let's remind him who built the world he lives in." Grace nodded, her fear transforming into fire. "I'm done being the ghost in his story." And somewhere in the city, Nathaniel Voss smiled, because the next move was already his. Rain streaked the tall windows of Hale Urban Group's Manhattan office, the city glowing like molten gold beyond the glass. Grace stood before the mirror in her private office, her reflection sharp, the dark navy suit, the subtle diamond earrings, her hair swept back with precision. The woman staring back wasn't the trembling wife who once hid behind marble walls. She was control itself. Still, as she fastened her Cartier watch, her hand trembled slightly. Old fear had a way of echoing, even through confidence. Marcus noticed. "You don't have to face him tonight," he said quietly. "We can send the proposal through legal." Grace shook her head. "If I don't show up, he wins. I want him to see me, alive, unbroken, untouchable." It was the night of the Manhattan Investment Gala, hosted at the Ritz-Carlton, the same ballroom where her world had shattered years ago. The irony was almost cruel, but Grace intended to turn that same stage into the first battlefield of her return. The evening air smelled of rain and wealth. Black cars lined the red carpet, cameras flashing as billionaires, models, and journalists entered the crystal-lit hall. When Grace stepped out of the Hale Company car, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Reporters recognized her instantly. "Grace Whitmore, Mrs. Voss." She cut them off with a small smile. "It's Miss Whitmore," she said, her voice steady. Inside, chandeliers glittered overhead. Marcus stood beside her, his presence grounding her like gravity. Across the room, Nathaniel Voss turned, his expression freezing for a heartbeat as their eyes met. Callie was on his arm, dripping in silver and diamonds, her smile brittle. Grace felt her pulse steady. Every step she took toward him was deliberate, heels striking marble like a countdown. "Good evening, Mr. Voss," she said. Nate's lips curved into a smirk. "Grace, I didn't realize ghosts got invitations." "Only to haunt the guilty," she replied softly. His jaw tightened. "You've made quite a scene lately. Lawsuits, whistleblower claims. I'd be careful. Manhattan has a short memory for fallen women." "Maybe," she said, "but it remembers thieves longer." Callie's smile faltered. Grace's gaze flicked briefly toward her, just long enough to make the woman look away. The orchestra began to play. Grace turned to Marcus. "Shall we?" she said, offering her hand. Together they moved onto the dance floor. The moment their hands touched, the photographers swarmed, flashes painting light across the room. Nate watched, frozen, realizing what was happening. The cameras weren't on him anymore. When the music ended, Grace leaned in to Marcus and whispered, "Now he knows what losing power feels like." But the night wasn't over. An hour later, Eli Carter texted her, "Got it. Hidden file decrypted. Sending proof now." Grace slipped into a quiet hallway, checking her phone. A folder opened. Voss Dynamics Internal Audit. There it was. Every forged contract, every false signature, every illegal transfer tied to offshore accounts. The entire empire was now a ticking bomb. She saved it onto a drive and looked up at the reflection in the mirror across from her. Her heart raced, not with fear, but anticipation. Marcus found her moments later. "Are you ready?" Grace nodded. "Tomorrow, we expose him." But as they walked back toward the ballroom, the lights suddenly dimmed. A large screen flickered to life above the stage, playing a video. Nathaniel's voice filled the room. "You think you can bury me, Grace? You forget who built your world." Gasps filled the crowd. Her phone buzzed, from him. "You wanted a war, darling? Let's see who survives." Grace stared at the screen, fury igniting behind her calm smile. And for the first time, she didn't just want justice. She wanted the empire that burned her to collapse in public flame. The video ended in stunned silence. The ballroom's glittering perfection fractured into whispers, cameras flashing, faces twisting between curiosity and scandal. On the giant screen behind the stage, Nathaniel's face lingered a second longer before fading to black. Grace stood perfectly still, every instinct screaming to run, but she didn't. She straightened her shoulders, turned toward the audience, and smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said into the microphone that a trembling staff member handed her, "if Mr. Voss wanted to remind you who he is, I believe he just did." Laughter rippled through the crowd. She stepped away from the spotlight, calm on the outside, fury simmering under her skin. Marcus appeared at her side, guiding her through the chaos. "We need to leave," he whispered. "No," she said. "He wants me rattled. I won't give him that." From across the room, Nathaniel's smile was razor-sharp. "You always did love the stage," he said as he approached. "How does it feel, stealing the spotlight from the men who built it?" Grace met his eyes. "Funny, I thought you built your empire on my name." The guests were watching now, pretending not to. $1,000 symphony played softly in the background, while two former lovers turned their heartbreak into theater. Callie hovered behind Nate, pale under the chandelier light. "Nathaniel, let's not do this here," she murmured. "Oh, but that's exactly what he wants," Grace said, her voice cutting through the music. "He's always loved an audience." Nate's grin faltered. "Careful, Grace. You've made enemies you don't even know about." Grace leaned closer. "And you've made mistakes you can't bury anymore." She walked away before he could respond, her heels echoing across marble like a verdict. Outside, the night air was sharp and wet, Manhattan glittering with deceit. Marcus caught up to her, wrapping his jacket around her shoulders. "You handled that beautifully," he said. Grace's lips twitched into a faint smile. That wasn't handling, that was warning. The next morning, news channels erupted. Screens across Times Square flashed her face. "Grace Whitmore stands up to Nathaniel Voss at gala." Social media buzzed with videos of their confrontation. In his office at Voss Tower, Nate smashed a crystal glass against the wall. "She's turning this into a circus?" Callie watched nervously. "She has the media now. Maybe we should settle." "Settle?" Nate roared. "She's nothing without my name. She'll crumble like she always does." But she didn't. At Hale Urban Group, Grace and Marcus gathered their core team, Julia, Eli, and a few trusted legal advisors. The room was tense but electric. "We go public," Marcus said. "We expose everything. The fraud, the offshore accounts, the forged contracts. We'll let the evidence speak." Eli nodded. "The files are ready, but we need to time it perfectly. One mistake, and he'll spin it before it hits the press." Grace looked out the window, the skyline glowing in morning light. "Tomorrow," she said, "at 10 a.m., we release everything." That night she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, the hum of the city below, the same city that once watched her fall. She thought of her baby, her lost years, her name dragged through dirt. And for the first time, she allowed herself to cry, not from pain, but from release. At dawn, she stood in front of the mirror again, calm, resolute. She touched the diamond pendant she once pawned and had quietly bought back. It wasn't a symbol of love anymore. It was proof she could lose everything and still return shining. At 9:59 a.m., Julia hit upload. Files began flooding online. Contracts, bank records, signatures. The truth was unstoppable now. Across Manhattan, Nathaniel's phone buzzed violently. His empire was burning, and on Park Avenue, Grace Whitmore watched the first headline appear. And finally, she smiled. The war had begun. The morning of the press explosion arrived with a strange calm. Grace Whitmore stepped into the Park Avenue headquarters of Hale Urban Group at exactly 8:30 a.m., her coffee in one hand, her iPhone buzzing nonstop in the other. Headlines already dominated every screen in the city. Voss Dynamics accused of financial fraud. Whistleblower evidence points to former CEO Nathaniel Voss. Marcus was waiting in the boardroom, flanked by the company's legal counsel and PR executives. He turned as she entered. "You ready for this?" Grace placed her coffee down, took a deep breath, and nodded. "For 5 years, I've been surviving him. Today, I finish him." At 9 a.m., reporters gathered outside both Hale Urban Group and Voss Tower. Cameras lined the streets, helicopters circled above. The storm had begun. Inside Voss Dynamics, the boardroom was chaos. Nathaniel slammed his hands on the table, shouting, "Who leaked this?" Executives shifted in silence. Callie sat rigid, mascara smudged, scrolling through Twitter. "Sir," one of the CFOs stammered, "the documents, they're real." Nate froze. "What? They match internal transaction IDs. Someone had access to everything, even the encrypted backups. For a second, Nathaniel's composure cracked. Find me who did this, now. But the truth was already spreading faster than money could silence it. At 10 a.m., Grace entered Hale's boardroom, cameras flashing. She wore a tailored black suit, every line of her posture sharp and deliberate. The world expected anger, but what they saw was quiet authority. Good morning, she began. Hale Urban Group has chosen transparency, because truth in business shouldn't be a luxury. The evidence we released was gathered through legal channels and verified by independent auditors. Every number, every signature is real. A reporter called out, Miss Whitmore, is it true that your ex-husband was behind the fraud? Grace paused. The silence thickened. She could have humiliated him in one word, but she didn't. Instead, she said, Nathaniel Voss made his choices. I made mine. And mine is to build something that lasts without destroying people to get there. The cameras clicked wildly. Across the city, Nate watched the live stream from his penthouse. His face was pale, rage trembling beneath the surface. She's turning this into sainthood, he snarled. Get me a statement ready, now. But when he returned to the boardroom to prepare his public defense, the room was nearly empty. Half the executives were gone, computers were wiped, phones disconnected. Where the hell is everyone? He barked. The remaining assistant swallowed hard. They resigned, sir. The board's calling for an emergency meeting without you. Nathaniel stared out the window, watching the skyline he thought he owned. Somewhere out there, Grace was speaking, and for the first time the city was listening to her instead of him. Meanwhile, back at Hale Urban Group, Marcus leaned toward Grace. The Department of Justice just opened an investigation. It's official. Grace nodded slowly. Good. Let him face what he built. But before she could breathe, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She answered. Silence, then a familiar voice. You think this is over? Nate's voice rasped through the line. You took my company, my name, but you still wear the scar I gave you. You'll never be free of me. Her pulse spiked, but she steadied her tone. You're right, she said softly. Scars don't disappear. They just stop bleeding. She hung up, exhaled, and turned to the window. The Manhattan skyline gleamed below, reborn under sunlight. Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder. You won, Grace. She looked at him, calm, powerful, unstoppable. Not yet, she said. Winning isn't making him fall. It's making sure he never rises again. And as the sirens wailed toward Voss Tower that afternoon, Grace Whitmore became more than a survivor. She became the ghost that haunted his empire. The storm hit Manhattan that night, not with thunder, but with breaking news. FBI raids Voss Dynamics headquarters. Insider whistleblower reveals decade-long fraud scheme. Every major network ran Grace Whitmore's name. Once branded a thief, she was now the woman who had exposed one of the biggest corporate scandals in years. But Grace didn't celebrate. She watched the news in silence from her apartment, the city lights reflecting off her glass of untouched wine. The victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like gravity finally releasing her after years of holding her under. Marcus entered quietly, tossing his coat over the chair. They're calling it the Whitmore Revelation, he said with a faint smile. You did it. She turned toward him, her voice low. He's not done, not until he's humiliated. Marcus sighed. Then let him drown in his own storm. You don't need to wade in after him. Grace shook her head. You don't understand, Nate. His rage is the only thing keeping him alive. Across town, Nathaniel Voss sat alone in his penthouse, whiskey in hand, his empire collapsing one phone call at a time. Screens around him flashed stock charts plunging into red. Every major investor had pulled out. He threw the glass at the TV, watching it shatter against her face on the screen. You think you've won, Grace? He muttered. You don't even know what I've done. Callie appeared in the doorway, mascara streaked down her cheeks. The FBI took everything. The accounts, the servers, were finished, Nate. He turned slowly, eyes bloodshot. We? You think you're part of this? I was loyal, she whispered. But I'm not going to prison for you. His smile was venom. Then you already are. The next day, Grace received an anonymous delivery at her office. No sender, just a black envelope sealed with wax. Inside was a flash drive and a handwritten note. You want the truth? Meet me where it began. Marcus tried to stop her. It's bait. Don't go. I have to, she said. If he's desperate enough to reach out, there's something he's hiding. That night, rain fell hard on the Plaza Hotel, the same ballroom where her world had once shattered. Grace entered through the side door, wearing a long trench coat, her heels echoing on the marble floor. The lights were dim, the air thick with memory. Nate was waiting near the bar, unshaven, his suit wrinkled. "You look the same," he said with a hollow laugh. "Beautiful, untouchable, still pretending you're better than me." "I stopped pretending years ago," Grace replied. He tossed her the flash drive. "Everything you missed. The real story. You think I just forged your signature? You were part of it, Grace. You designed the shell company that hid my money." She frowned. "You're lying." "Am I?" His voice was soft, almost pitying. "You built the foundation for me, every floor, every blueprint. I just turned it into something bigger." Grace felt a chill creep up her spine. Was it true? Had he used her designs as a cover all along? Before she could respond, Callie appeared behind Nate, soaked from the rain. Her lipstick was smeared, her eyes wild. "Stop lying, Nate," she shouted. "You forged her blueprints. You used her name because no one would question a woman they thought was naive." Nate's face twisted with rage. "You don't know what you're talking about." Callie stepped closer. "I recorded everything." Grace stared, stunned. "You what?" Callie met her eyes. "I'm done being scared. He made me part of it too. I'm not going down for him." Nate lunged, but Grace moved first, grabbing the nearest champagne bottle and smashing it across the table between them. The noise echoed like a gunshot. Security rushed in moments later, pulling Nate back as he shouted her name like a curse. Grace stood still, soaked in rain and adrenaline, Callie trembling beside her. For the first time, the man who had owned her world stood powerless, and the women he broke stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the same storm. The Plaza Ballroom was sealed off within the hour. Police lights painted red and blue across its golden facade as cameras swarmed outside. Grace sat in one of the velvet chairs near the broken bar, her hands shaking slightly as she gave her statement to the detectives. Callie sat opposite her, silent, soaked, mascara smudged into gray shadows under her eyes. Nathaniel Voss had been escorted out moments earlier, his wrists cuffed, his rage echoing down the marble hall. "She did this," he shouted, pointing at Grace. "She planned everything." Grace didn't flinch. "He's lying," she said softly. "He always does." When the officers left, Callie leaned forward, voice trembling. "You don't have to thank me. I didn't do it for you. I just couldn't breathe anymore." Grace nodded slowly. "You did the right thing. That's more than most people ever do." They sat in silence, two women connected by the wreckage of one man's empire. Then Callie reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small silver flash drive. "This has everything," she whispered. "Audio recordings, financials, emails. He thought he deleted them, but I kept backups." Grace hesitated. "Why give it to me?" "Because you'll know what to do with it," Callie said, eyes hollow. "You're the only one who ever scared him." By morning, the story was everywhere. Voss arrested at the Plaza. Assistant confirms evidence of fraud and abuse. Reporters camped outside Grace's building, begging for comment. But she didn't speak. She spent the morning in the Hale Urban Group's glass conference room, watching the city from above. Marcus entered quietly, 2 coffees in hand. "The DOJ wants to meet. They're building the case with what Callie gave them. This could end it." Grace took the coffee, but her expression stayed distant. "He'll fight till his last breath." Marcus studied her. "And you?" She met his gaze, her voice low. "I stopped fighting years ago. Now I'm just finishing." Later that afternoon, Grace stood in front of the mirror in her office, the same mirror she'd looked into the night she returned to Manhattan. But this time she wasn't trembling. She saw power reflected back, the kind that comes not from money or revenge, but from surviving hell, and walking out of it standing tall. That evening she attended the emergency investor meeting called at Hale Urban Group. Dozens of industry leaders filled the room, including journalists and government officials. Grace stood at the head of the table, Callie sitting quietly behind her as witness. One investor asked, "Miss Whitmore, what happens to Voss Dynamics now?" Grace paused, letting the silence stretch. "It collapses," she said, "and out of that collapse we rebuild the city we were promised, one not built on lies, but on accountability." The crowd erupted in applause. Cameras flashed, pens scribbled, and Callie lowered her head, tears streaking her cheeks. But just as Grace left the room, Julia Byrne appeared, her phone in hand. "You should see this," she said urgently. On the screen was a live video from a courthouse entrance. Nathaniel, free on bail, walking out with that same arrogant smile. "I built New York," he told reporters. "You can't erase a king with gossip and bitterness. This is far from over." Grace's stomach tightened. He's trying to spin it again. Marcus clenched his jaw. "Let him talk. We have the truth, and the world's watching." Grace exhaled slowly, straightening her coat. "Then we show them who really built this city." Outside, thunder rumbled across the skyline. The reflection of lightning flashed across the glass walls, her face and the storm merging as one. She wasn't just the woman who survived Nathaniel Voss anymore. She was the storm that would wash him away. The rain came down in sheets the next morning, washing Manhattan in silver. Grace Whitmore stood by her window, watching the city blur under the storm. Every headline still carried his name. Voss released on bail, empire under siege. But the news cycle, she knew, was fickle. If she didn't act fast, the truth would fade into noise. That's when her phone buzzed. It was Callie. Her voice shook through the speaker. "He's looking for me, Grace. He knows I gave you the files." Grace's breath caught. "Where are you?" "I can't say," Callie whispered. "But there's something you don't have yet, something that can end him completely." "What is it?" Callie hesitated. "A recording. From the night he forged your signature." Grace's heart stopped. "You recorded it?" "I didn't mean to. My phone was on. It caught everything. His voice, his confession. It's been hidden in my old iCloud backup. I'm sending it to Julia." "Callie, be careful," Grace said. "He's desperate now." There was silence on the line, then Callie's soft reply, "You were right. He destroys everything he touches, including me." The call ended. Minutes later, Julia arrived at Hale Urban Group, drenched from the rain, clutching her laptop. "It's real," she said breathlessly. "The recording, it's him." Marcus joined them in the conference room as Julia pressed play. Nathaniel's voice filled the room, smooth and cold. "I made it look like her signature. She'll take the fall. I'll get the sympathy. She's a liability, and liabilities are meant to be erased." The sound of ice clinking in a glass followed. Then, faintly, Callie's voice, "What if she finds out?" Nathaniel laughed. "She won't. By the time anyone believes her, she'll be too broken to speak." When the recording ended, no one moved. The only sound was the hum of the city outside. Grace leaned forward slowly, her eyes wet but fierce. "We release it. Today." Marcus hesitated. "You sure? This isn't just business anymore. It's blood." She nodded. "Then let him bleed truth." Within hours, Julia uploaded the audio clip to multiple verified news outlets. She added a single caption, "The tape that built an empire." By evening, every major network was playing it. Anchors replayed his voice again and again, dissecting every sentence. Social media erupted. Voss tape trended globally. At Voss Tower, chaos reigned. Investors fled, employees resigned, and protesters gathered outside chanting, "Justice for Grace." Nate watched the broadcast from his penthouse, his composure finally cracking. "This isn't possible," he muttered, pacing. "She can't win, not her." But when he turned toward the window, he saw it. Giant LED screens across Times Square flashing his own words, subtitled in white, "Liabilities are meant to be erased." The city that once bowed to him was laughing now. Meanwhile, Grace sat in the quiet of her office, the noise of the world fading. Marcus entered, holding a small velvet box. "You did it," he said softly. "It's over." Grace smiled faintly. "Not yet, but soon." He opened the box, a silver key engraved with her initials. The new Hale headquarters in Midtown, a new start. Grace stared at it for a long time before whispering, "Funny, he built towers to own the city, I'll build one to free it." Outside, thunder rolled again, echoing like applause. The storm that once buried her now answered to her name. And as Nathaniel Voss watched his empire collapse brick by brick, he finally understood. Grace Whitmore hadn't returned for revenge. She'd returned to rewrite the ending. The courthouse on Foley Square buzzed like a beehive the morning the world turned its eyes on the people v. Nathaniel Voss. Reporters crowded the marble steps, their umbrellas gleaming under the drizzle. Grace Whitmore stepped out of a black sedan, her heels clicking against wet stone, flanked by Marcus and Julia. The flash of cameras turned the air electric. "Miss Whitmore, how does it feel to face him again?" a reporter shouted. Grace paused for half a second, her gaze steady. "It feels like closure," she said, and continued walking. Inside, the courtroom felt colder than the rain. Rows of polished benches lined the walls, filled with journalists, investors, and former Voss employees. Nathaniel sat at the defense table in a dark tailored suit, his arrogance dimmed but not extinguished. When his eyes found hers, the corners of his mouth lifted. "Always loved a show," he muttered as she passed. Grace didn't look at him. "This isn't a show," she said softly. "It's your mirror." Judge Wallace entered, his gavel striking once. "Court is in session." The prosecution began with evidence from the tape, the recording Callie had released. The jury leaned forward as Nathaniel's voice filled the chamber. "Liabilities are meant to be erased." A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. Nathaniel shifted in his seat, jaw tightening. His attorney stood quickly. "Your Honor, that tape was obtained illegally." "Overruled," the judge said. "Continue." Julia, seated behind the prosecution table, whispered to Grace, "That's the first crack." For hours, they presented documents, forged contracts, and witness testimonies. Grace watched every exhibit, every detail she'd once lived as a nightmare. It was surreal, seeing her own pain turned into evidence, her trauma cataloged in binders and files. But she didn't flinch. Not this time. Then it was Nathaniel's turn to speak. He took the stand with the swagger of a man who still believed charm could erase truth. "I loved my wife," he began, glancing at Grace. "She was fragile, emotional. The stress of our life, our success, was too much for her. I covered her mistakes because I cared." The courtroom murmured. Grace sat still, expression unreadable. Marcus's hand brushed against hers beneath the table, grounding her. The prosecutor stepped forward. "Mr. Voss, you claim Mrs. Whitmore was unstable, yet these emails show you ordered a team to falsify her signature on multiple contracts." Nate smirked. "If that were true, I'd be in prison." The prosecutor pressed play on a small device. The courtroom filled with the sound of his own voice again. Clear, damning, irrefutable. "I made it look like her signature." Silence followed. Then, slowly, laughter broke out in the gallery. Sharp, incredulous laughter that even the gavel couldn't silence. Nathaniel's mask cracked. His composure dissolved into fury. "She set me up. She always wanted to destroy me." The judge's voice cut through the chaos. "Order, Mr. Voss, you will control yourself or be removed." He slammed his hand against the stand, pointing at Grace. "You'll regret this. I made you. I can unmake you." Grace finally met his eyes. "You already did. And somehow I'm still here." The courtroom held its breath. Nathaniel's face twisted. Rage, disbelief, something close to fear. When the session adjourned, Grace walked out through a storm of reporters, rain mixing with the flash of lights. Marcus held an umbrella over her as she stepped down the marble stairs. "You think he'll go to prison?" he asked. Grace looked up at the gray sky. "He'll face what he gave," she said, "and I'll finally walk free." That night, news anchors repeated the same headline across every channel. Nathaniel Voss faces perjury and fraud charges after explosive court session. But to Grace, the most powerful moment wasn't the verdict yet to come. It was the sound of her own footsteps leaving that courtroom, steady and unafraid. For the first time, she wasn't running from her past. She was walking through it, and it was bowing to her. The morning of the verdict dawned cold and still. A thin mist clung to the skyline like smoke from a dying fire. Grace Whitmore stood before the mirror in her apartment, fastening the pearl earrings she'd worn the day she first met Nathaniel. They no longer felt like symbols of love, only reminders of what she'd survived. Marcus entered quietly, his reflection appearing beside hers. "The jury's back," he said. Grace took a breath. Then, "So am I." Outside the courthouse, crowds had gathered, holding signs that read "Justice for Grace and Truth Wins." Cameras turned as she stepped out of the black car, her heels echoing against the pavement. The world that once mocked her now watched in reverence. Inside, Nathaniel sat rigid at the defense table. His custom-tailored suit looked ill-fitted now, his tie askew, his confidence bleeding away. The jury filed in, faces solemn. The air thickened. Judge Wallace adjusted his glasses. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The forewoman stood. "We have, Your Honor." Grace's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "On the charge of corporate fraud, we find the defendant guilty." The room erupted. Reporters whispered, pens scratched, flashes burst. Nathaniel's jaw locked, his knuckles white. The judge continued. "On the charge of falsifying federal documents, guilty. On the charge of perjury, guilty." Nate's lawyer tried to object, but his words were drowned out by the rising noise of justice finally breaking through marble silence. The judge struck his gavel once. "Mr. Voss, you are hereby remanded into federal custody pending sentencing." Grace exhaled, her breath trembling. 5 years of pain, humiliation, exile, all crystallized into that single moment of vindication. Nathaniel turned toward her, eyes wild. "You think this makes you clean?" he spat. "You'll never escape me. You are what I made you." Grace stood, her voice even. "You're right, Nathaniel. You made me. And that was your last mistake." Security escorted him away. Cameras followed every step of his fall, the once untouchable billionaire in handcuffs, shouting her name like a curse. Outside, the sky broke open with rain, heavy and cold, but it felt like absolution. Reporters crowded her as she descended the courthouse steps. "Miss Whitmore, what's next for you?" one asked. Grace smiled faintly. "Living." Later that evening, she and Marcus sat by the window of a small rooftop bar overlooking the city. The storm had cleared, and Manhattan glittered below them, alive again. "It's strange," she said softly. "I thought I'd feel happier." Marcus handed her a glass of wine. "Justice doesn't erase pain, Grace. It just gives it a place to rest." She nodded. "Then maybe I can finally sleep." Down below, screens in Times Square replayed the same headline. Nathaniel Voss found guilty on all counts. Stock tickers showed Voss Dynamics collapsing, its value dropping by the second. Investors pulled out, subsidiaries dissolved, and buildings once bearing his name were stripped bare. The empire that had taken everything from her was dying in real time. Grace took a slow sip of wine, watching the lights flicker across his ruined name. "He built an empire on lies," she said quietly. "I'll build one on truth." Marcus smiled. "Then let's start tomorrow." As the night deepened, the city pulsed with life again. For the first time in years, Grace felt the rhythm of it, the heartbeat of survival, of new beginnings. She closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. And somewhere inside a prison transport van headed north, Nathaniel Voss screamed into the dark, realizing too late that the woman he tried to destroy had become the architect of his end. The news of Nathaniel Voss's conviction spread like wildfire, shaking Wall Street and echoing through every boardroom in Manhattan. By morning, Grace Whitmore's name wasn't just trending. It was legend. The woman who took down a titan, the architect of her own justice. But Grace didn't feel like a hero. Not yet. That morning, she sat in her new office at Hale Urban Group's Park Avenue Tower, staring out at the skyline. The city glowed beneath the sunrise, clean after the storm. Marcus walked in, setting a coffee beside her. "He'll be sentenced in 2 weeks," he said. "Federal prosecutors are recommending 15 years. Grace nodded, still watching the light touch the glass buildings. "He'll find a way to talk before then," she murmured. Marcus frowned. "What makes you think that?" "Because he can't stand silence," she said. "He'll want the last word." And she was right. That afternoon, Grace received a call from a restricted number. She hesitated, then answered. "Miss Whitmore?" A male voice said. "This is Warden Keller from Rikers. Mr. Voss has requested a private meeting before his sentencing. He says it's important." Marcus shook his head immediately when she told him. "Grace, don't. He'll try to manipulate you again." Grace looked at him steadily. "I'm not the same woman he broke. I want to hear him, one last time. Not for him. For me." The next day, she walked through the prison gates, her heels echoing across concrete. The air smelled of metal and rain. A guard led her through corridors until they stopped before a small visiting room divided by glass. Nathaniel sat on the other side, wearing a beige jumpsuit instead of his usual tailored suit. His hair was grayer, his face drawn, but his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were the same. She picked up the phone. "You wanted to see me?" He leaned back, smirking faintly. "You look good, Grace. Prison suits you, in reverse." She didn't react. "Say what you came to say." He stared at her for a long moment, then sighed. "You think you won. You didn't. You just replaced one devil with another." "Marcus Hale. Do you even know who you're working for?" Grace narrowed her eyes. "What are you talking about? He's no saint," Nate said. "Hale Urban Group has its own secrets, backroom deals, off-the-record investors. He's using your name, your face, your pain. You're his redemption arc." Grace held his gaze. "And you think that makes you clean?" He smiled. "No. It just makes you naive, again." Grace leaned closer to the glass. You spent years manipulating people, Nathaniel. Maybe you can't imagine anyone doing good without an angle. But Marcus didn't save me to own me. He saved me because he believed in me. That's something you'll never understand." His expression flickered. Anger, envy, something raw. "You'll miss me when he disappoints you," he said quietly. "You need an enemy, Grace. Without me, who are you?" She took a breath, calm and unbroken. "Free." For the first time, Nathaniel had no answer. The smirk faded, replaced by something small, fear. He looked away, jaw clenched. Grace placed her hand against the glass. "I came here to say thank you," she said softly, "because you destroyed me, and that destruction made me unbreakable." She stood, ending the conversation before he could respond. As she walked away, the guards closed the door behind her, and Nathaniel's voice echoed faintly through the hall. "You'll see, Grace. They all fall." Outside, the air was crisp, the city alive with noise. Marcus waited by the car. "How did it go?" he asked. Grace smiled faintly. "He confessed more than he meant to." As they drove off, she looked back once, at the steel bars shrinking in the distance. The man who once ruled her world was now trapped inside his own lies. And for the first time, Grace Whitmore no longer felt haunted. She felt whole. The sentencing day arrived under a hard, metallic sky. Manhattan was quieter than usual, as if the city itself held its breath. Reporters crowded outside the federal courthouse, microphones raised like weapons, waiting for the final blow in the story that had consumed the nation. Grace Whitmore stood at the steps, wrapped in a tailored black coat, the chill wind tossing strands of her hair across her face. Marcus walked beside her, calm, steady. He reached out, brushing her hand. "You don't have to go inside," he said. "Yes, I do," she replied. "I need to see it end." Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy with anticipation. The seats were packed. Journalists, investors, victims of Voss Dynamics' fraudulent deals. Callie sat near the front, pale but resolute, clutching a folded statement in her trembling hands. Julia sat beside her, pen poised, ready to document history. Nathaniel was led in by U.S. Marshals, wrists bound in steel. The once untouchable mogul now looked hollow, his power stripped bare. Yet even in his prison uniform he carried a strange arrogance, the ghost of his old self refusing to die. Judge Wallace entered. The murmur of the crowd stilled instantly. "Court will come to order," he said. "We are here for sentencing in the People v. Nathaniel Voss." The prosecutor stood first, detailing years of deceit, corporate manipulation, and the lives destroyed by greed. Grace listened, her heartbeat steady, her eyes fixed forward. Then it was Callie's turn. She walked to the stand, voice fragile but unwavering. "He told me once that power was measured by the number of people too afraid to speak against you," she said. "Well, look around, Nathaniel. We're all speaking now." A quiet wave of emotion passed through the room. Even the judge paused. Finally, Nathaniel was given the chance to speak. He stood, straightening his posture. "I made mistakes," he began, voice smooth, calculated. "But every empire stands on compromise. If I'm guilty of anything, it's wanting too much, building too big. People like Grace Whitmore," he said, his tone sharpening, "they wouldn't exist without men like me to give them a story to tell." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Grace stayed seated, her expression unreadable. Judge Wallace's voice cut through. "Mr. Voss, arrogance will not serve you here. The court sentences you to 20 years in federal prison without parole." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Nathaniel's head snapped up, disbelief flashing in his eyes. 20 years? He barked. "You can't." The gavel struck once. "You will also forfeit your assets and holdings obtained through fraudulent means," the judge continued. "This includes Voss Tower, which will be liquidated under federal order." Nathaniel turned sharply toward Grace. "You think you've won? You'll fall next, just like me." Grace rose slowly, her voice clear, controlled. "You're right about one thing, Nathaniel. You built an empire, and I learned how to destroy one." The marshals led him away, his protests echoing uselessly down the corridor. Cameras followed as the doors closed behind him, capturing the last image of the man who thought himself untouchable. Outside, the air was cold and sharp, but Grace felt lighter than she had in years. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions, flashes exploding like stars. "Miss Whitmore, how does it feel?" She smiled faintly. "It feels like peace." Marcus joined her at the base of the steps. "It's over," he said quietly. Grace looked up at the sky, gray clouds breaking open to reveal a sliver of light. "No," she said, "it's just beginning." As they walked away, the news broadcast rolled across the city. Voss sentenced to 20 years, empire falls, justice prevails. And in that moment, Grace Whitmore became more than a survivor. She became the reckoning, the storm that rebuilt the sky after the ruin. The morning after the sentencing, the world had changed. For the first time in years, Grace Whitmore woke to silence. No reporters outside her window, no phone buzzing with chaos. The air inside her Park Avenue apartment felt still, sacred. She stood barefoot by the window, the sunrise painting the skyline gold. Manhattan was alive again, and so was she. On the kitchen counter lay a stack of newspapers. Every headline bore her name. Grace Whitmore ends Voss dynasty, the woman who redefined justice. Her story had become legend overnight. Marcus entered, tie undone, coffee steaming in his hand. "You're on the cover of Forbes," he said with a quiet smile. "They're calling you the future of ethical business." Grace chuckled softly. Ethical business. That's a phrase I never thought I'd hear next to my name. He leaned against the counter. "You earned it. You turned destruction into design." She looked at him, her smile fading into something deeper. Gratitude, peace. "Marcus, I couldn't have done this without you." He shook his head. "You could have. You just needed someone to remind you who you were." For the first time, Grace didn't argue. She let the truth settle. Later that day, she stood before the media one last time, but this time it wasn't about vengeance or scandal. Hale Urban Group had organized a public forum to announce a new initiative. The Whitmore Foundation for Women in Business Integrity. A nonprofit dedicated to supporting women who'd been silenced or sabotaged in male-dominated industries. The auditorium overflowed. Cameras clicked. The same press that once tore her apart now leaned forward to listen. Grace stepped to the podium, her posture calm, her voice steady. "For years I believed survival meant silence," she began. "I thought dignity was keeping my pain hidden, but silence doesn't heal. It rots. It feeds power to the wrong people. So today I'm breaking that silence for good." The crowd was still, hanging on every word. She continued. "We've built systems that reward deceit and punish honesty. We glorify those who take and shame those who fall. But I've learned something. The fall isn't the end. Sometimes it's the blueprint for something greater." Marcus watched from the front row, pride softening his expression. Callie sat beside Julia, holding hands tightly. Two women who had been broken by the same man, now rebuilt by truth. Grace's eyes swept the room. This foundation isn't about revenge. It's about rewriting the story, so that when women like me are told they're finished, they'll know it's just the first draft. Thunderous applause filled the hall. Some cried. Some stood. Grace stepped back, breathing deeply, her heart light for the first time in years. After the event, she and Marcus walked through Central Park, the air crisp with early spring. Street musicians played jazz near Bethesda Fountain. Children laughed by the lake. Life felt ordinary again, beautifully, miraculously ordinary. Marcus glanced at her. "So what now?" Grace smiled, looking up at the trees. "Now I live, without fear, without ghosts," he chuckled. "And without headlines?" "Hopefully," she said. "Though knowing you, you'll find a way to get us on the front page again." He laughed, then grew quiet. "You know, Grace, you didn't just win. You changed things, for people who'll never even meet you." Grace looked at him, the setting sun reflected in her eyes. "Then maybe that's what redemption really is, not the applause, but the echo that stays after." As they walked on, the city lights shimmered around them like a heartbeat reborn. The storm had ended. And for the first time, Grace Whitmore didn't feel like a woman who survived a monster. She felt like the architect who rebuilt the world after him. The Hamptons sky glowed in soft shades of rose and gold, the Atlantic whispering against the shore like applause. White tents fluttered in the breeze, and rows of hydrangeas lined the path leading to an arched altar draped in ivory silk. It was the first day of summer, and the first day of the rest of Grace Whitmore's life. She stood in front of a wide mirror inside the seaside villa, her reflection shimmering in the morning light. Her gown wasn't extravagant, just elegant. Satin and lace, simple but breathtaking. The last time she had worn white, she was walking into a marriage that would cage her. Today, she was walking toward freedom. Julia fastened the final button on her dress. "You nervous?" Grace smiled faintly. "Not nervous, just amazed. I never thought peace could look like this." Callie, now working as director of the Whitmore Foundation, entered holding a bouquet of lilies. "You deserve this, Grace," she said softly. "After everything, you found your own ending." Grace took the bouquet, her eyes warm. "No," she said. "I built it." Outside, guests gathered under the open tent. Not investors or reporters this time, but people who had become her family through the fire. Survivors, advocates, friends. Marcus waited at the altar, his suit crisp, his expression calm but tender. When he saw her step out, every sound around them seemed to fade. The music began. Grace walked down the aisle barefoot on the soft grass, each step light, certain. The ocean breeze caught her veil, lifting it like a whisper. When she reached Marcus, he took her hands gently. "You sure about this?" he teased quietly. Grace laughed through tears. "You saved me once, but I came back on my own. That's how I know I'm ready." The officiant smiled. "Then let's begin." As the ceremony unfolded, Grace's mind wandered for a moment. Back to the night she cried alone in the Boston apartment, to the courthouse where she faced her past, to the woman who once whispered, "I'm done," and disappeared into the snow. That woman was gone now, but she'd left behind the strength Grace was standing on. When the officiant said, "Do you take this man?" Grace interrupted softly, smiling through tears. "I take him as my equal." Laughter and applause rippled through the crowd. Marcus squeezed her hands. "And I take her as my compass," he said. When they exchanged vows, there were no promises of perfection. Only truth, respect, and partnership. And when they kissed, the guests stood and cheered, confetti catching in the sunlight. Later, during the reception, Grace stood on the wooden deck overlooking the ocean. The sky had turned deep orange, waves crashing in slow rhythm. Julia handed her a glass of champagne. "To the woman who rebuilt her world," she said. Grace clinked glasses with her. "To the women who refused to let it break them." At that moment, a news broadcast flickered on one of the guests' phones, Nathaniel Voss's name appearing again. He had been transferred to a federal penitentiary upstate. The camera caught him being led through gray gates, his face pale, hollow. Grace turned her eyes back to the sea, her voice calm. "Let the past stay where it belongs." Marcus joined her, wrapping an arm around her waist. "He can't touch you anymore," she smiled. "He never will again." Fireworks bloomed above the water, painting the night sky in colors of rebirth. The guests cheered, laughter echoing over the waves. Grace leaned into Marcus, whispering, "I used to think love was safety. Now I know, it's freedom." He kissed her forehead. "And you built it yourself." Under that glittering Hampton sky, Grace Whitmore didn't just marry a man. She married peace, redemption, and the life she created from the ruins of her past. He trial, the chaos, the noise. But Grace Whitmore's name remained, not as a scandal, but as a legacy. Her foundation had grown into a movement. The Whitmore Initiative now funded hundreds of women-owned startups, rebuilt schools, and sponsored programs in cities from New York to Seattle. For every woman who had been silenced, Grace made sure there was a microphone waiting. It was early morning at her Hamptons home. Waves murmured beyond the windows, gulls tracing the horizon. Grace sat at the long oak table, sipping black coffee, reviewing reports on her MacBook Air. The numbers weren't just profits, they were lives rebuilt, futures rewritten. Marcus entered in jeans and a white shirt, barefoot, holding 2 cups of Starbucks coffee. "You're up early again," he said with that quiet smile she'd come to love. Grace smiled back. "Old habits. Empires don't build themselves," he chuckled. "Except this time, it's a quiet empire, one made of second chances." She closed the laptop, stood, and walked to the window. Outside, the ocean shimmered in morning light, endless and forgiving. "I used to think power meant control," she said softly. "Now I think it's peace, the kind you fight to keep." Marcus came behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "And you earned every inch of it." Later that day, Grace traveled to Manhattan for the grand opening of the Whitmore Center for Ethical Leadership. The new tower, sleek glass and silver, stood on the very block where Voss Tower had once loomed. She paused at the entrance, looking up at the sky. "From ashes," she whispered. Inside, hundreds gathered, entrepreneurs, journalists, survivors. Julia, now head of communications, greeted her with a hug. "It's done," she said, tears in her eyes. "We turned his ruin into your beginning." Grace walked the stage to thunderous applause. Her speech was simple, heartfelt. "A few years ago," she began, "I was told I'd never survive without someone else's name. Today, that name no longer exists. but mine stands." The crowd erupted. Cameras flashed. Grace continued, "This building isn't just glass and steel. It's proof that integrity isn't weakness. It's endurance. And for those who've been betrayed, forgotten, or broken, you are not your scars. You are the architect of what comes next." As she stepped off stage, she caught sight of something unexpected. A small child sitting beside Callie in the front row, drawing on a notepad. Callie smiled. "Her name's Hope," she said softly. "After you." Grace knelt beside the girl, who showed her a messy crayon sketch of a tall building reaching the clouds. "That's yours?" Grace asked. Hope nodded proudly. "It's the tallest one. It never falls." Grace smiled, blinking away tears. "That's the best kind of building." That night, back in the Hamptons, Grace and Marcus sat on the deck as the waves whispered below. Lanterns glowed in soft circles of light. "Do you ever miss it?" Marcus asked. "The fight?" Grace shook her head. "The fight made me. But peace keeps me human." He handed her a leather-bound notebook, its cover embossed with her initials. "Your stories inspired millions," he said. "Maybe it's time you tell it your way." Grace looked at the blank first page, the pen in her hand. The ocean wind lifted her hair as she began to write. "Once I was a wife who lost everything. Now I am a woman who built it all back, stronger, wiser, free." She paused, looked toward the horizon and whispered, "Thank you for breaking me, Nathaniel, because through the cracks I found the light." And as the sun sank into the sea, Grace Whitmore closed the chapter on pain and opened the book on peace, her quiet empire finally complete. Tralivit contentro vucain elda noi. So that's how our story ends. You're still here, aren't you? If you've stayed until now, maybe something in Grace's journey touched a part of you. That quiet place where pain meets strength. Her story isn't just about revenge or wealth. It's about rebuilding, about standing back up when the world swears you can't. Marcus Aurelius once said, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." That's the heart of this story, turning wounds into wisdom, scars into strength, and silence into power. Grace didn't wait for someone to save her. She became her own rescue. And maybe that's what we all need to remember, that healing isn't loud. It's quiet. It happens in the small, brave moments when no one's watching. So my friends, if this story made you feel something, even for a second, don't let it stop here. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that broken doesn't mean finished. Hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and keep walking this road with us. Because just like Grace, your story isn't over. It's only beginning.